So picture this. A factory worker in Bangladesh spends 12 hours to stitch one shirt. The cotton may be grown in India, the buttons may come from China, the cloth may be dyed in Vietnam. The shirt travels oceans and lands in a shop in a mall in New York, London, or Paris, and is sold for $60. The person who made it maybe takes less than $1 from that sale. And then here's the really uncomfortable question. What if this isn't an error? A flaw in the global economy? What if it's the feature? What if certain countries aren't poor because the system has failed them, but because the system needs them to be? For decades, we've been fed one story. Poor countries will develop. Rich countries will help them develop. Everyone will get richer. Globalization will lift all boats. And there's some truth in that. Hundreds of millions of people, in fact, have been lifted out of abject poverty over the past few decades. But beneath this success story is a darker, more complex reality. Because although poor countries may have become richer, the gap between rich and poor countries has stayed massive. And wealthy countries have remained critically dependent on cheap labor, cheap inputs, and cheap production from developing countries. Which brings us to a strange possibility. Maybe rich countries are not just benefiting from poor countries, maybe they are dependent on them. To see how that works, we need to trace the money. Let's start with something simple, a smartphone. You might think that the company that physically assembled the phone takes home the largest slice of profit. They don't.
The factory itself likely earns a sliver of the final sale price. Most of the profits head somewhere else, to the company that owns the brand, the patents, the software, the distribution networks, the financial infrastructure. In other words, the most lucrative part of making a product does not come from the people who make the product. It comes from the people who control the system surrounding the product. This applies everywhere. Coffee farmers grow the beans. Chocolate farmers grow the cocoa. Textile workers make the garments. Miners extract the minerals. And then the biggest profits accrue miles away in the corporate headquarters, the financial centers, and the investment funds of rich countries. It is not unlike owning the casino rather than gambling at the table. You do not have to win every game. You are guaranteed a small share from every single one. And this is where the magic begins. Rich countries are not necessarily rich because they are producing more. In fact, many produce less, but they are taking control of the parts of the economy that command highest profit margins. Financial services, technology, patents, intellectual property, and global logistics, the command centers of the economy. And poorer countries are then competing for the less lucrative part of the economy, jobs, and factories, and foreign investment. And to attract this, countries must maintain lower costs, lower wages, lower taxes, lower regulation, lest a competitor come along. The race to remain the cheapest option never ends. A worker in Ethiopia cannot suddenly demand fair wages or a raise because a company will easily pack up and head to Bangladesh. Think of how illogical this is. Your workers are getting more productive. Your factories are more efficient. You export a ton of goods, and you are still pushed to keep your prices rock bottom. You are running faster and faster, and the finish line keeps moving farther away. Of course, this does not mean that poor countries are stuck forever. South Korea and Taiwan went from the world's poorest countries to its richest. China lifted hundreds of millions into the middle class and is a superpower in manufacturing. But what did these countries do? They became producers of technology and owners of brands and intellectual property. They took over their supply chains and their own financing and investment models. They climbed up the value chain.
And this caused conflict, because when countries compete with the powers that already exist, trade disputes, tariffs, investment restrictions, technology blocks all start coming into play. What looks like business turns into a matter of national security, because controlling production is about controlling wealth, and controlling wealth is power. Interestingly, wealthy countries want poor countries to develop, up to a point. They want large consumer markets, they want political stability, they want economic growth, but they greatly benefit when a worker in the developing world takes home a sliver of profit, because a clothing item costs them a fraction less when they buy it in their expensive home country. Think about inflation. Consumers in wealthy countries have been living in an era of incredible low prices for decades. Clothing, electronics, furniture, household goods, all produced largely in countries where wages are astronomically lower. That trickle-down benefit has ensured higher corporate profits and low prices for consumers in the West. Everyone in the rich world has come to expect it. But what happens if wages everywhere suddenly equal equalize tomorrow. Many goods would be incredibly expensive, and business models in rich countries would have to collapse or dramatically restructure. The current global economy is not just connected to inequality, it is largely built upon it. The uncomfortable truth under the gloss of globalization is not about poverty, but about differences. Differences in wages, in bargaining power, in capital access, in ownership of production. And those differences create significant advantages for countries and institutions at the top. However, the narrative that it is simply wealthy nations exploiting poor nations is also not the whole story. Rich countries themselves are becoming increasingly vulnerable. Those global supply chains that fueled growth have created dependencies, where a shutdown on one continent can have ripple effects all over the world, and political conflict in one region can destabilize an entire industry in another. That same global economy that made goods cheaper has also made the world fragile.
Now we are seeing cracks. Countries are trying to repatriate production, protect strategically important industries, and reduce reliance on foreign suppliers, including technology providers. This means that the same system that drove modern economic growth is now being questioned by the countries that benefit the most. So here we have an ironic paradox. Countries with high levels of development need poor countries to produce goods cheaply, while poorer countries need rich countries to provide markets and investment. But at the same time, each side is trying to claim a greater share of the value produced. That tension is likely to characterize the next age of the global economy. When someone asks why poor countries remain poor and rich countries remain rich, the explanation is far more complicated than mere corruption, bad policy, or bad luck. It's about how the whole system is designed, who produces, who owns, who controls, who writes the rules. And perhaps most critically, the most important question is not whether poor countries can get rich. History shows they absolutely can. The most important question is what would happen if every poor country actually succeeded in climbing up the value chain? Who would be left at the bottom?